Morning, everyone. I am delighted to be here today to help launch this very important conversation about trade policy and to introduce Jason Grumet, the founder and president of the Bipartisan Policy Center. And I can think of no better venue or forum to begin this conversation. This is the perfect venue to talk about saving an important multilateral institution and to keep it from becoming largely irrelevant, and to use it and to use American interests and American soft power to move forward with not only US economic interests, but global economic interests, and to stop certain countries that will remain unnamed, at least during my introductory remarks, from constantly moving the World Trade Organization toward lowest common denominator outcomes. In the wee hours of this morning, the World Trade Organization moved, or shall we say limped, into the closing statements and outcomes of the 12th Ministerial Conference. The good news is it actually had an outcome. The sad news is a lot of it was lowest common denominator. They didn't, the good news is they didn't roll backwards on things like the moratorium on cross-border digital transfers and e-commerce. They made a little bit of progress on important sustainability issues like overfishing, but only a tiny bit of progress, where I believe, and a lot of us believe, the WTO could be so much more effective in addressing key international trade and related, for example, sustainability issues that we all care about. And so today I am really delighted to be able to welcome and introduce Jason Grumet, who is going to lead this discussion with two of my favorite senators. And Senator Rob Portman, my longtime mentor, former boss, friend, and former USTR, obviously, and Senator Coons, who I have admired from afar for a long time, who fits right in this small, I'm sorry to say, group of members of Congress who clearly put country before party and before self-interest. And it's the perfect group to be talking about trade policy and about highest common denominator, positive sum outcomes. And just, to close on my part, these two gentlemen, these two senators have in the hopper a really, really interesting piece of trade legislation. And if you're not familiar with it, I hope you will become familiar with it, because it seeks to, let's say, shake the box and shake things up a little bit in terms of US trade policy and in terms of the WTO and multilateral and plurilateral trade negotiations, such that we don't find ourselves constantly in a situation where the WTO's requirement for consensus allows one or two or three countries to block the progress that the vast majority of countries want to make, including the United States. And this particular approach that the senators, I hope, will be talking about could enable us to get to highest common denominator outcomes. So with that said, Jason, let me turn the virtual podium over to you. Thank you so much for hosting this discussion. And senators, thank you so very much for being not just a part of this conversation, but really leading the initiative to get something done.
Well, thank you, Ambassador. Susan, you have had your finger on the pulse of global trade for a few decades, and your readout on the ministerial that ended at around 3 a.m. Much appreciated. So delighted, Senators Coons and Portman, to have you with us. I think most folks know that you are two of the hardest working members in the Congress. And Senator Portman, I know we are finding you from an airport on the way to a meeting. So just before we start talking about the Trade System Preservation Act, we're going to talk a lot about the word preservation, and we might even define the term plurilateral before the end of this next 30 minutes. I just want to acknowledge broadly that the two of you vindicate the fundamental premise that there's such a thing as productive partisanship, where a commitment to evidence and a curiosity about other people's ideas and a willingness to explore the unknown actually provides resilient policy in a diverse country. And so we always love having you together with us. What I want to do, and I think we got just about a half an hour, is kind of three things. Just get a little bit of your sense on, so why does this matter, right? What is it about the moment we are in globally and trade policy that should matter to everyday Americans? Want to focus a little bit, obviously, on the elements of the legislation. And then, we are at this moment of the first significant meeting of the WTO in 4 years. Got a little issue called inflation that some people are focusing on, and tariffs and USICA. And so we might broaden the conversation a little bit before we are done. But just to start out, let me start with you, Senator Portman. Why are you here today? What you guys work on a lot of things. What is it about the Trade System Preservation Act that has you interested in talking with Senator Coons and the BPC?
Well, Jason, first of all, thank you very much for having us. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you okay. We're not hearing you great.
Start with why don't we start?
Oh, flip it over to.
As soon as I am inside, I'm now in a parking garage. Let me get inside the building, and I'll be ready to go in about 5 minutes.
I have every confidence that Chris Coons can talk about this for 4 or 5 minutes. Senator,
thank you, Jason, and thank you, Rob. First, I just want to thank Senator Portman for being a great partner on many different things. We have several different bills that we're trying to get over the finish line this year, and initiatives around trade, our foundation of and work on the US-UK Free Trade Caucus, our work together on trade-related legislation, and our work together on trying to help advance debt for nature swaps as a tool to advance conservation have been some of the more enjoyable things I've been engaged in with Senator Portman. He's also one of the 20 senators, the bipartisan group of senators engaged in work around gun safety and mental health. So first, let me just thank Rob Portman. I keep trying to persuade him to change his mind about retiring. He tells me it's a little too late, but I keep hoping I could talk him out of it because we've got more good work to do. And Jason, thank you and the Bipartisan Policy Center for being a convening space that provides both policy insight and the opportunity to cross our increasingly sharp partisan divides in Congress and to gain advice from seasoned former members of Congress and policy leaders like yourself. I think it's important for us, and this was part of the point Susan was making in her introduction, we need to keep offering some alternative pathways for us to engage in 21st century trade issues. Trade in this current environment is as much about standard setting between sophisticated, economically advanced economies as it is the issues that dominated trade in the last century, issues around globalization. So from my state perspective, trade in the last century was about cars and chickens and selling our chickens to the developing world, and countries that were part of the developing world trying to sell cars in competition with our car plants. And that's a lot of why globalization, which has had its winners and losers, in no small part has driven a lot of populism on the left and the right. It's become a divisive political issue in our country. And I've been trying to work with Rob and other colleagues in the Senate to try and help folks see that there is a window here for looking at the relationship between the individual, the economy, and the state in a digital economy, where there are closed societies that impose strict censorship, and there are open societies, the US, UK, EU, Canada, our Indo-Pacific partners in the Quad, who share a view of the importance of open societies and open economies that could be a basis for some trade partnerships. There's also a similarity across the US, Canada, UK, and EU in terms of having climate ambition, where I think we can and should align around new standards for climate. So I think strengthening our alliances, strengthening our partnerships that will provide incentives for decarbonization of the industrial sector without putting at a disadvantage our own companies, and finding ways to incentivize companies to handle data and technology in ways that have an impact on society, but without harming freedom and without hurting democracy. These are the sorts of things that I'm excited about advancing. The TSP Act that you referenced, Jason, that Senator Portman and I have introduced, would give the president authority to advance U.S. trade interests and set standards in key sectors with like-minded partners. And I think it's an important step forward towards revitalizing the global rules-based trading system by enabling productive negotiations at the WTO, which, as you said, is sort of limping through the latest ministerial, and I think needs to show some vitality and some relevance in the current global political and market environment. And I hope that I have now talked long enough to enable my colleague from Ohio to join me.
Magical. Senator Portman, your reputation for multitasking is well known. Congratulations for getting from Logan Airport to an actual desk. Senator Coons just provided an overview of the legislation. And I wonder if you would just reflect a little bit on something that the senator mentioned, which is just the evolution of trade politics, right? There used to be a reasonably predictable kind of partisan premise around free trade and protectionism that is, if nothing less than scrambled, kind of turned on its head in the last several years. And just talk a little bit about, is there a center of gravity around trade that you think actually can motivate a bipartisan coalition to get things done?
Well, absolutely. And Jason, thank you again for convening this and for all the good work you do with the Bipartisan Policy Center. I always love engaging with you. My friend Chris Coons and I do a lot of different things together, whether it's on the gun safety issues, you said very recently, but with regard to global conservation issues, we've done a lot of good work together. And pretty much every time there is a bipartisan agreement in Congress, there is Chris Coons in the middle of it. He also happens to have a decent relationship with his fellow Delawarean, and so it's helpful, frankly, that he's a go-between between the White House and Congress at a time when that relationship is sometimes strained. And finally, I just want to thank him for his work on the trade issue. This is not easy for either one of us for the reason that Jason just suggested, which is, trade is a more politically sensitive issue than ever, and the free trade versus protectionist differences of the past have been blurred, so that in both of our parties, we have some of both. And I hope we have enough kind of in the middle, what I would call balanced trade, where we believe in trade. We think trade opening is a good thing, but we also believe that there ought to be enforcement of trade rules. And I think the WTO fits very nicely into this. One of the changes, Jason, that you suggest has happened is that the WTO has lost its effectiveness. And it has become largely an appellate body where there is actually, in my view, too much litigation, and sometimes litigation not based on the principles that we set out with the WTO, which is to expand trade. And so what Chris and I are trying to do is to revitalize a once effective organization, so that once again, as Susan Schwab, my dear friend and a former U.S. trade representative and someone who really understands these issues well, as she has said, it's to save an important multilateral institution. And one way to do that is to say, when you have a group of countries that can agree on something, and one or a handful of countries are disagreeing, you end up with either nothing, which is too often the case, or as Susan Schwab said, the lowest common denominator. And although I'm really glad we had the ministerial, I think it's important to talk. Because of COVID, it had been postponed. The ministerial is probably, from what I hear, an example of that. But specifically, let's talk about things like environmental goods, where one country has been able to block progress on a multilateral agreement. Wouldn't it be great if, say, 100 or so countries in the world could come together and say, well, we actually can come up with an agreement here. It's not going to include every country, but the vast majority of countries. And we're not going to allow free riders. In other words, once we come up with these agreements, we're all going to make a commitment to our own trade opening and our own potential sacrifices, if you will. And we're not going to let other countries come in and take advantage of the positive aspect of it without also being part of this agreement. So that, in a nutshell, is what these plurilateral agreements would be like. We've done it before. We did it with government procurement. It's worked well with the WTO. And what Senator Coons and I have done, which is unusual, is we have introduced the first legislation since 2015 that actually provides for a new trade promotion authority. And why is that important? Well, in order to have these plurilateral agreements be effective, we need more than the WTO taking action. We need to have the US Congress be willing to say that we will take it up on a TPA basis, meaning that it will not be subject to being amended to death with nickel and diming the agreement, but instead it will be subject to a majority vote without amendment, essentially what has been called in the past fast track. Other countries require that usually to negotiate with us because they don't want to put their last and best offer on the table, and they think the Congress isn't going to change that. So having trade promotion authority connected with plurilateral agreements on things like environmental goods, but also on steel and aluminum and chemicals and cement and paper and shipbuilding and so many things where there are controversial issues. If we can get the vast majority of the countries in the world to agree with us and to move forward on those kinds of agreements, it seems as that would be a very important step forward, both again to save the institution, to have the WTO once again be effective, and also in the interest of the United States to have more trade opening, and frankly to ensure that certain countries, specifically China, but also others, are not willing to block good agreements. So I think it's really exciting. And again, I appreciate Chris being willing to step forward on this. It's, again, in both of our caucuses, we have people who are skeptics about this. We have a member of my caucus who would prefer to see the WTO go away altogether and is promoting that. And others, frankly, agree with him. On Chris's side, there are others who would say, well, to have trade promotion authority for anything is a bad idea. And yet we are both willing to join hands here and move forward on something that I think is going to be great for the country, great for the trade agenda, and great for getting the WTO back in the middle of things.
Senator, so Senator Coons, if I were to summarize this is kind of a courageous mend it, don't end it moment. But I want to press the issue a little bit. I think just looking at a little bit of the feedback from this last ministerial, the Director General somewhat optimistically said the outcomes demonstrate that the WTO is in fact capable of responding to emergencies of our time. Former Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman, well known to all of you, said it accomplished the bare minimum needed to keep the institution alive and kicking. And so, those are probably two versions of optimism. But you're making very significant changes to the premise, which I'd like you to explain a little bit more. And why stick with the WTO, right? We had the GATT for 50 years. That was then changed in the new regime. We've had the WTO for about 30. Is this a moment where we need substantial change, or the institution is going to have to be fundamentally reimagined? And why stick with it?
Well, I'll just briefly say that I think to just tear down the WTO altogether and start from scratch is unlikely to be successful in the current global economic and political moment. And I'd rather give the administration and Congress a shove in the direction of looking at what sector-specific and plurilateral agreements can accomplish before we take the radical step of trying to burn down the WTO. Look, it's long overdue for updates, as Senator Portman ably summarized. The ability of one specific country to block progress has ground down the ways in which it could have moved forward. And I think this bill is one way to help encourage the kinds of negotiations that could succeed. I will remind you that the USMCA was ratified under the Trump administration. It was something that ended up with a strong bipartisan vote, both in the House and the Senate, and made it to the president's desk. And I think it is not impossible for global trade agreements to advance the interests of workers, the environment, and our economy. And I think some of the things that are central to this bill could be real improvements to the WTO process and could allow us to move forward on sector-specific agreements. Given where we are, there's a lot of concern in Congress about how we can nearshore or onshore, how we can strengthen manufacturing employment in the United States, how we can pull together with our closest allies in a way that makes us more competitive. And in my view, adding to that menu, the challenge of having to write a new global trade agenda from scratch is more than we are likely to be able to accomplish. So when Rob came to me with this idea, it struck me as something that was well worth trying.
So Senator Portman, this is because thou who shall not be named is China, right? We all know that, but I don't think we should be worried about asserting it. Unpack a little bit the pragmatics of plurilateralism. So my understanding is there's 164 members in the WTO. And so at the moment, it's consensus of 164. Plurilateralism means anything between 2 and 163. But in one of the sectors that you're focused on, whether it's digital commerce or environment, what would you imagine? Are these regional trade agreements? Is this going to be 150 countries? What's your expectation of how this would actually play out?
Yeah, I think it's very, very exciting, Jason, because you mentioned the digital services agreements, and there's a lot of discussion about that. Exactly how it's formulated is, unclear. But let me give you an example. In IPEF, which is the new Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, there's a lot of discussion about e-commerce and digital services. That is not a trade opening agreement. It's not like the Trans-Pacific Partnership would have been or the new one would be. But it is countries coming together in common cause to talk about these issues. And some have said that might be a candidate. So as an example, you might start with the countries of the Indo-Pacific region. China is not a member of that group, but pretty much all of our allies in the region are. And that could find its way over to the WTO in a plurilateral form. So that's one area where you could certainly see progress. And there are other areas that are more difficult from a political point of view. I mentioned steel and aluminum and chemicals and cement and shipbuilding, refining as an example. These are areas where other governments, particularly China, do a significant amount of subsidization. And if you could come up with an agreement that said that there would not be state-owned enterprises or excessive subsidies that could unfairly trade in those areas, that would be a huge accomplishment and would enable us to bring together our allies to ensure that either countries that are non-market economies like China that do this on a large-scale basis, or some other countries that may be more market-oriented but choose to subsidize heavily, would feel as though they needed to get on the train with everybody else and take advantage of the agreement. And so it could also have to have a positive effect in that manner. But in the meantime, it would expand trade in a way that was fair, and it would enable the WTO to play the role of negotiating, which is what its original intent was. The primary purpose of WTO over the years has been to negotiate. You think about all the multilateral agreements that have been done over the years. Unfortunately, those have been sidetracked, including the Doha round, which I worked on for a long time, and Susan worked on for a long time. And the United States was a strong proponent of doing something, but we just couldn't get to yes because it required this consensus approach. In other words, all the countries, you mentioned 164 countries coming together. But an alternative to that is to allow those like-minded countries to come together and make progress, and that will bring more people on board over time. The United States, the EU, and Japan, as an example, did great work on developing new rules to combat industrial subsidies and state-owned enterprises. But there is no way, in my view, that those will not be blocked in the WTO by China and perhaps other countries. So why not move forward with like-minded countries? Again, don't allow others to be free riders to take advantage of the benefits without making the commitments on the market opening side and the subsidy side. Another is just the need for us to have more transparency. And this has been a constant issue, as you know, with China not listing their subsidies, which they're required to do under the WTO rules. So I think there's an opportunity here to move ahead and to make progress, and in the meantime, encourage other countries to get on board.
So we have about 10 minutes, and I have to take the opportunity, Senator Coons, to ask you a little bit about tariffs, and Senator Portman, you a little bit about USICA. So in the frustration over the failure of WTO to do what we had all expected, President Trump levied significant tariffs toward the end of his administration, $350 billion or so by some calculations. And there's some consideration now, driven both by, I think, concerns about supply chain around priorities like climate change and solar, but also just the general sense that these could be inflationary, to roll some of these back. And I wonder if you could just share your own views, but your sense of whether there's going to be movement now to unilaterally step back from some of those tariffs.
Well, Jason, I think the president knows well the pain that inflation is imposing on families across our country, and is reviewing the Trump era tariffs, a number of which irritated, annoyed, strained our relationships with some of our closest partners, and the tariffs on China. Some of them are strategic and significant. Some of them are just imposing needless costs. I mean, I think tariffs on things like bicycles and toasters aren't likely to restore American manufacturing in those areas, just to casually mention a few. And I do think tariff reduction is one of the few tools, actions that the executive branch can actually take that may reduce consumer costs. So I think it's possible for there to be some unilateral and strategic tariff reduction. I think they're trying to achieve progress with China and use some of that tariff leverage to see if we can get other concessions. But frankly, I wouldn't be surprised to see some tariff reduction that'll have direct benefits for consumer pricing. And if I can, just to go back to the basic point I made at the outset about this bill, it is useful for us to engage with similarly developed countries and like-minded countries in a plurilateral way to advance the idea of standard setting around climate, standard setting around digital trade. And I think one of the things that we can do is to help shift some of those supply chains away from China and towards either hemispheric partners such as Guatemala that Senator Portman and I visited together, or to other countries where there are both strategic and security and consumer cost reasons to do that. So there's a lot of things I'm excited about in this bill, and I think you will see some movement towards strategic tariff reduction for consumer price reduction reasons by the administration.
So Senator Portman, one thing everyone knows, if there's a bill titled Portman Coons or Coons Portman, the details have been worked. So I want to talk a little bit about the prospects for action before the end of the Congress. Not a lot of days left in the session. And so if you could talk a little bit about possible vehicles, but also, I guess Senator Coons, I don't know what you did wrong, but you're one of the few people who are not a member of the USICA conference, but Senator Portman, you are. And if you could just put this in the context of the connection to what we're trying to do in terms of domestic competitiveness, the other side of that coin. There's been some discussion recently about trade provisions being an obstacle. So you talk just a little bit about the prospects for the legislation, but how you see it interacting in particular with the USICA conference.
Yeah, well, great. Chris Coons is chair of a number of important subcommittees, and none of them happen to have the jurisdiction of USICA, so he is blessed with not being one of the conferees. But he's very engaged in it, and we want to get to yes, we want to get this done. There are a number of reasons for it. One is there's some important trade aspects to it. Let me touch on that, but first, just briefly on China. You didn't ask me about the China tariffs, you asked Chris, but I think there ought to be an exclusion process with regard to the tariffs, so that, as an example, if the product is not made in the United States, then there can be an exclusion. Those exclusions were provided for a while. they're not in place now. And so I believe the tariffs need to stay in place because they are there for a good reason, including China has not made its commitments under phase one of the agreement with China. The 301 report is very specific as to where China is not playing by the rules. And for us to eliminate all the tariffs rather than having an exclusion process for some of the tariffs would send the wrong message to China and to the rest of the world. We want to have the dialogue we had with China lead to these commitments that we've got from them, and we want to be sure those commitments are enforced. And again, it goes to my point earlier that balanced trade is about expanding trade, but also enforcing the trade rules, which will enable us to get more support for trade generally among our constituents who are often skeptical. USICA, I have one idea that I want to throw out there, and Senator Coons and I have not talked about this specifically. We've talked about it more generally.
Breaking news.
The trade part of it is probably the most difficult of the various negotiations that are going on right now. In my own committee, I think we've pretty much resolved the issues. It's the Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee as an example, but on the trade side, I'm on the Finance Committee also. We find ourselves at loggerheads. And one of the reasons is that the Democrats in the House added to the bill, not just trade adjustment assistance, which tends to be supported by Democrats and not Republicans in general, but also expanded it. So extending it is one thing, but expanding it takes it to a place where I think very few, if any, Republicans could support it. And remember, the USICA bill that came out of the Senate was already negotiated between Republicans and Democrats. It had 19 Republicans, all the Democrats, and the White House was on board. So the House has added something that's going to be difficult to get done. The one way I think it might be able to be resolved, which would be interesting, would be to do what we have always done, with one exception, which was a few years ago under reconciliation with no Republican support. But we've always combined trade adjustment assistance. This is for workers affected by trade. Then those extensions with trade openings, specifically trade promotion authority, which again gives the United States Congress the ability to take up agreements on a so-called fast track basis so that they cannot be subject to amendments and being changed. Now, one idea is to say, let's do what we have always done historically, which is to add some trade opening here. And a TPA, as an example, with the country of the UK, with whom we have ongoing negotiations, and we're probably about 4/5 of the way toward a final agreement, is one idea. Chris Coons happens to be the Democrat lead on that. He and I have taken that cudgel up. We're about to introduce legislation that I'm not announcing today, but which will help make that happen, we hope. So trade promotion authority for that single purpose, very limited TPA, is one idea. But another is what we're talking about today, trade promotion authority for these plurilateral agreements, sector specific at the WTO, where I think we can get a lot of bipartisan support, as Senator Coons has indicated. So I think, Jason, there's a potential breakthrough here if we could have this this moment where we are saying, okay, we are willing to extend existing trade promotion, existing trade adjustment assistance, but do it in a way where we have also trade enhancement with it, as we always have done. So I think that's an opportunity for us to try to break the gridlock here and move forward on so many important aspects of this USICA bill, also known as the Competes bill, also known as the China bill, also known as the Competitiveness bill. Bottom line is it has a lot of really important things to put America in a better position to be able to compete, not just with China, but with the rest of the world going forward.
So this is the kind of nimble, collaborative, real-time problem solving that has always caused us to have the greatest respect for the two of you. I want to thank you both for this. And also, just as we end, you mentioned a number of things you've done together. And Senator Portman, I just want to make sure we thank you for all of your leadership around the opioids crisis. Our staff has had a tremendous time working with yours over the years, and we really appreciate that. And Senator Coons, I can't help but a shout out for the work that you and Senator Cornyn are doing on the Civic Security Democracy Act, which we're also really impressed by and proud to be a part of. So you two are remarkable members of the U.S. Senate. Appreciate everything that you have done for us today, and look forward to maybe circling back in a couple months about the passage of this legislation. So thanks for spending some time with us.
Thank you, Jason. Thank you,
Jason.
Rob. Always good being on with you.
Thanks, Chris. Likewise, and thanks to Susan Schwab also, who I think is still with us, Ambassador Schwab. So we look forward to continuing to work with you, Jason, on all kinds of issues, including trade.
Have a great weekend. Thanks.
Take care. Thanks, everybody.